joining me today. I'm going to start with your books, actually. Although we're current affairs, I want to take it back to both Napoleon and Churchill, both of whom were friends, I suppose, of the Jewish people at a time when many others were not. What was it, if anything, that links them together on that? What motivated them, and what, in a sense, were the results of that?
Well, it's a very good question. They were friends of the Jewish people in that they helped the Jewish people, both of them, but two different men from very different aspects of philo-Semitism. Napoleon didn't like Jews. He did great things for them, he liberated them, he let them out of the ghettos, he gave them civil and religious liberty, but he did it for French reasons, for entirely imperialistic French reasons. He realised that free Jews were a tremendous way of making a nation richer, and that was the reason that he did it. He appreciated their contributions to the arts, to science, to literature, to all of the great things, but he also wanted to ensure that France took advantage of their genius for commerce and finance. Churchill, on the other hand, very different. He wanted the maximum amount of liberty and freedom for Jews because he realised that they had given a greater contribution than any other race to the great causes of civilization in human history, and said so on a regular basis, despite many of the other people from his natural milieu, the upper classes, the British aristocracy of the late 19th and early 20th century, being anti-Semitic. And so these two men both were Philo-Semites in terms of policy, but only Churchill really was Philo-Semitic in terms of his emotions and his natural intellectual development.
And I suppose his core belief as well in that point. And if we look at Churchill for 1 second and move into that area, of course, one of his, I suppose, signature causes was Zionism. I mean, he was a famous Zionist in this regard, again, somewhat bucking the trend on that. How do you think Churchill would view how Israel is viewed in the world today?
I think he'd hate it. He very much was a supporter, of course, of the creation of the State of Israel, when an awful lot of other people, including the Foreign Secretary of the day, the Labour Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin, who went along with it, whilst being an anti-Semite, and I don't think there's any much doubt in it. When I've looked at some of the papers of Clement Attlee, leader of the Labour Party, of course, but also Prime Minister at the time of the creation of the State of Israel, in the Bodleian Library at Oxford, I found all sorts of horribly anti-Semitic things that he wrote as well, in letters to his brother, for example. And so one has to forget all this stuff about socialists being much more likely to be pro-Jewish. That just simply wasn't the case, at least amongst British socialists in the 1940s. It was just not true. The fact was you had some extraordinary, totally wonderful people like Winston Churchill who were Zionists, and then an establishment that was appallingly anti-Zionist, and a Foreign Office, of course, in Whitehall, which was ideologically and institutionally anti-Israel.
Now, this point on the Foreign Office I'll pick up on, because of course it seems to be a facet of many foreign offices across Europe in particular, but even the US State Department, that there's something institutionally almost anti-Israel about them. What do you think it explains that?
Well, there are two schools of thought on this. The first is that it was rational. It was a perfectly logical response to the fact that you have 22 Arab countries and one Jewish country. You have 22 Arab countries that have huge amounts of oil, which are necessary, of course, for the running of the world's economy, and one Jewish country which has got nothing at all to offer the rest of the world in terms of raw materials, but has everything to offer in terms of its morality and its spiritualism and its decency and its right to survive and its history. And I'm afraid it's the job of the Foreign Office really to put the former above the latter. That's one way to look at it, the realpolitik way of looking at it. The other way of looking at it is that there was an awful lot of truly foul anti-Semitism that was pretty much taken for granted. It was standard fare for the upper classes of both Britain and America and a lot of other countries. France, of course, one can add into that group, and many others. Even after the horrors of Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen and the rest had been seen by the world.
Okay, that's a historical kind of look at things, say 50, 60 years ago. You're, in the contemporary world, you're a signatory to the Friends of Israel initiative, a wonderful organisation that does indeed bring together leaders in various fields who want to recognise Israel for the positives it brings. If we're to look at the contemporary world, we see, of course, the rise of anti-Israel movements in Europe, other places, the rise of boycott movements along those lines. What do you think motivates those? Is it the sort of the rational analysis you mentioned of the foreign offices, or is it more the anti-Semitism coming back to the fore?
Well, the Friends of Israel initiative, which is actually run by and staffed by and generally actually supported by non-Jews, Catholics and Protestants and people of no religion, but actually we go out of our way to try to have people who can't be in any way connected to some kind of Zionist conspiracy or anything like that, because none of us are Jewish. But what we do all feel is that Israel has got to be judged on the same basis as other nation states. You can't assume that Israel has any duty or any responsibility to behave like a state that sort of simply in the world doesn't exist. On such extraordinary levels of self-denial that it will allow itself consistently to have its right to exist drawn into question endlessly in a way that just doesn't happen with any other states. Not even the really young states in Sudan, for example, do people say that it doesn't have the right to exist. And so what we're trying to do in the Friends of Israel initiative is to get Israel treated just like any other nation state, not just of its region, but of its size or its type or its kind. And that is incredibly difficult to do because people consistently try to say that Israel has the tiniest things that Israel ever does that's held in a negative way against it, that it is therefore an argument against that state's rights to exist, which you'd never see that against Spain or Norway or Switzerland.
So what's motivating that, Andrew?
To go back to my last answer, there is a basic problem, it strikes me, in Western civilization, by which we still feel a sense of viciousness and aggression and anti-Semitism, which doesn't extend to now, thank God, to any other race. To be anti-black, for example, is quite rightly considered a despicable attitude that is so antediluvian as to be morally wrong. To be anti-Jewish, on the other hand, in country after country, and I'm afraid that the number of those countries is expanding rather than contracting, has not got that same level of moral outrage. Now, why should that be? Considering that actually, when one looks at the activities of the Israeli state, it is a model democracy.
You make that point quite cogently and coherently. And yet we often see, when it comes to one of the contemporary scourges, terrorism within Europe today, that it's Jews who are attacked first and then the general population. But it is always a relationship, Jews and then the general population. Why is it that people haven't worked this out yet?
I think they have worked it out. They just don't want to face it. That's the problem, here. You saw it, of course, with the Charlie Hebdo attacks. All the concentration was on the cartoonists. At exactly the same time, however, Jews were being killed and Jews were being concentrated upon by the same killers. And the fact is that it is still, for some reason, some deep psychological problem that we have in the West, we don't want to face the obvious fact, which is that Jews, especially in Israel, are the canaries down the mine shaft, really. They are the first people who should let us all know that democracy is being attacked, that civilization is being attacked, and that we have to stand up for them if we're in any way going to be standing up for ourselves.